Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Our last class was a while ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago. We've been discussing book 2 of the Yoga Sutras, using, as usual, Edwin Bryant's book as our main textbook, but also drawing on other sources like Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga and other books. Book 2, so far the focus has been on Kriya Yoga, okay? And klesas has become one of the main themes that we've been discussing. Klesha means an affliction or an impediment to spiritual growth, spiritual progress. And there are 5 main kleshas. Can anyone rattle them off? Any of them? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the last one, clinging to life, abhinivesha. Good. First, let's go in order. Ignorance is the first one, avidya. Then? Yes, asmita, egoism. You're on a roll. 3rd and 4th. She already gave you number 5, so I just need 3 and 4. Going once, going twice. Come on, guys. Yeah, so now we're really there. Now 4 is aversion, so what's 3? It's the opposite of aversion. Come on, guys. Attachment. There we go. So, number 1, avidya, ignorance. Number 2, asmita, egoism. Number 3, raga, attachment. Number 4, dvesha, aversion. Number 5, clinging to life, abhinivesha. Okay? Very good. So these are the kleshas. Yoga Sutras promise us in 2.2 that through the practice of Kriya Yoga, we can attenuate the kleshas, tanukarana. We can make them very, we can reduce their force, minimize them. What is Kriya Yoga again? Another pop quiz. 3 main practices. You said breath, is that what you said? No, that doesn't fall under Kriya Yoga. What are the 3 main practices? Anyone? Huh? Kriya Yoga, it's literally the first sutra of book 2, 2.1. No, that's the asanam. So don't mix up Ashtanga Yoga with Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is just 3 practices, there's some overlap with niyamas in Ashtanga Yoga. That's my hint. 3 out of the 5 niyamas. Still not helping. Okay. Tapaha, austerity. Svadhyaya, which means, it means different things, but self-study, scriptural study, and also japa, mantra japa. Okay, swadhyaya. Ishvara pranidhana, surrender to or devotion toward the divine. Okay, so a lot of you look puzzled, and so I'm going to remind you of 2 point, because that's the basis of the entire book. Sorry, not 2.1. Yeah, 2.1. Here we go. Ready? 2.1. Tapaha swadhyaya ishvara pranidhanani kriya yogaha. The definition of Kriya Yoga is these 3 practices. Those 3 practices are 3 of the 5 niyamas. The niyamas being the 2nd of the 8-limbed yoga, Ashtanga Yoga. Okay? Yama, then niyama, then asana. See, this is good as a refresher. You guys are honest. I appreciate that. Okay. So always keep in mind this background. It's very important. The book begins by saying, hey, this is Kriya Yoga. This is why you need to practice it, because you can get rid of the kleshas that way. Okay? In that context, the last sutra we discussed last time was 2.11. 2.10, sorry. 2.10, page 192 of Edwin Bryant's book. Te pratiprasava heyaha sukshmaha. Okay. These subtle kleshas are completely destroyed through pratiprasava. That's what 2.10 says. However, pratiprasava itself has been interpreted in two different ways, at least, by different commentators and scholars, recent scholars. There's some controversy about how to understand pratiprasava, okay? And I mentioned an article by one of my PhD students when I was in India, named Susanta Bhattacharya, and he talks about these two different kinds of interpretations. One is called the ontological interpretation. The other is the epistemological interpretation, okay? The ontological interpretation is pratiprasava means what? After the attainment of asampragnata samadhi, the highest state of samadhi, what happens? It's kind of like what Sri Ramakrishna says when he says that in the state of samadhi, ordinary souls leave their body within 21 days. It's kind of like that. Because the idea is you get locked into that state of samadhi, you're not eating food, then what happens? You die. Not in a tragic way, it's a good death. The goal is death, in a certain sense. Good riddance to this body. And what happens when you die? The body, including the mind, which is just a subtle form of matter, dissolves back into the 5 elements. That's called pratiprasava. Okay, dissolution back into the 5 elements. Okay. But there's a different kind of interpretation of pratiprasava, which is called the epistemological interpretation. According to this view, pratiprasava is not actually, it doesn't require a physical death. After you attain asampragata samadhi, the highest state of samadhi, what happens? You identify mentally with the purusha, and you're therefore no longer identified with the klesas at the level of the mind. And therefore, you're free from them in a certain sense, and you can become a jivan mukta. You can become liberated while still in the physical body. You don't need to die. Okay? And there's a lot of controversy about which one to accept. Now, as far as I can tell, Bryant himself supports the ontological interpretation. Why do I think that? Because on page 193, he says pretty explicitly, the total dissolution of kleshas occurs only when the mind of the liberated yogi dissolves back into its original prakritic source upon the yogi's death. Kama, pratiprasava. I don't think he can be more explicit than that. You die. Okay. So now, with that as a background, we begin to discuss the sutras for today. Let me also give you a heads up on how I see this class proceeding. Today, I want us to discuss Sutras 11 through 14 of Book 2, okay? 2.11, 12, 13, and 14. Most of which concern the doctrines of karma and rebirth. That's going to be the main theme for today. And then, I know that I assigned more than that. I assigned 15, but that's way too much. There's a huge commentary. Bryant has a huge commentary in 2.15, and it's a very important sutra. Again, I don't want you to think this is too dark, but anyway, the sutra says, here's why everything is dukkham, why everything is suffering. Literally everything. And actually, suffering may not be the right translation. I like the word unsatisfactory better. Why is everything unsatisfactory at the end of the day? Even happy, pleasant experiences, unsatisfactory. All is too little that the world can give, as Sri Aurobindo said. Okay, so we're going to discuss that next time. So, our next 2 classes, I'm just giving you a heads up here. We have 2 classes in July, double the usual number. Thursday, July 10th, 7:30 p.m. And Thursday, July 24th at 7:30 p.m. So July 10th and July 24th. And our next assignment, so the assignment for our next class on Thursday, July 10th, will be to read Yoga Sutra 2.15 to 17. 15, 16, 17, those 3 sutras, and the accompanying commentary, and that would be pages 202 to 216 of Bryant. 14 pages, but you got plenty of time, more than 3 weeks to complete it, and it's very interesting reading. Okay, so now, with all that said, let's plunge into 2.11. Please repeat after me. This is page 194 of Bryant. Dhyana heyas tadvrittayaha. Okay. So, Tadvrittayaha. The tad here means those. Of those. So tadvrittayaha. The vrittis, the vrittayaha, of the kleshas mentioned in the previous sutra. Okay, the vrittis produced by those 5 kleshas we talked about, ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, clinging to life, are eliminated heyaha through what? Dhyana. Meditation, which is which limb of the Ashtanga Yoga, by the way? Come on, guys. It's the 8-limbed yoga. Yeah, very good. The 7th limb, exactly. It's the one just preceding samadhi, right? Good. So we can see there's a lot of overlap between the Ashtanga Yoga, which we have not yet discussed because it comes up a little bit later in Book 2, and Kriya Yoga and the processes involved. But we need to take them one at a time. So immediately, if you keep in your memory the preceding 10 sutras, you might be a little bit confused. Because 2.2, I think it's 2.2 or 2.3, tells us that, let me just verify which one it is. Yeah, it's 2.2. The purpose of Kriya Yoga is twofold: to bring about samadhi bhavanarthas, samadhi bhavanarthaha, and then the second purpose is klesha tanukaranarthascha. Through the practice of Kriya Yoga, the kleshas become attenuated. They get weakened, significantly weakened. Okay. Now here, heya, the word heya is used. Isn't there like an Outcast song called Heya? It was a good song. Anyway, okay. So heya. Heya is used in 2.11. It's also used in the previous verse. Te pratiprasava heya, the same term, heya, is used in 2.10 and 2.11. And just putting these back to back, you might be wondering, well, wait a minute. So through pratiprasava, we are eliminating the kleshas. And through dhyana, meditation, we are eliminating the vrittis. So then what's the purpose of Kriya Yoga? Right? And how do these 3 processes relate to each other? Kriya Yoga, dhyana, and pratiprasava. Okay? So I've explained this 3-step process to eliminate the kleshas. Let's read some of his commentary, Bryant's commentary, because it gives us some context, and then we can get to the main point. He says, this is now page 194, his commentary on 2.11. He says, Patanjali indicated, and I'm reading the second paragraph of his commentary, Patanjali indicated in 2.2, which I just read to you, that the kleshas are destroyed by Kriya Yoga, yet here he states that the vrittis produced by them are destroyed by meditation, dhyana. Vyasa clarifies that the seed power or fructifying ability of the kleshas is weakened by the practice of Kriya Yoga and then eradicated by the practice of meditation. Okay, so now there's a difference. So when it says klesha tanukarana, through Kriya Yoga, the kleshas are weakened. It's not eliminated, not completely eliminated. So that's why the first step in the process of eliminating kleshas is Kriya Yoga. Another pop quiz. What are the 3 practices in Kriya Yoga? I literally just said them, yeah. Third one, God. Exactly. Ishvara Pranidhana, that checks out. Yeah, Ishvara Pranidhana. Exactly, devotion to God, surrender to God. Austerity, tapa, swadhyaya, study, scriptural study and mantra japa. And then devotion toward, surrender to God. Through these 3 practices, the kleshas are attenuated. Then through dhyana, meditation, they are further, he says eradicated by the practice of meditation. Okay, but now still, eradication doesn't mean complete elimination because they still remain as burnt seeds. If you remember our discussion of pratiprasava, burnt seeds, and yet they're still there as burnt seeds. And so, how do you get rid of eliminate even the burnt seeds? Through the 3rd process of pratiprasava. Which, I lean toward the ontological interpretation of pratiprasava because I think it's also more in accordance with the classical, lived tradition. If you look at the great yogis, it's kind of like the Jaina tradition. I think we talked about this in previous class. The great Jaina monks, the goal for them is to leave the body through starvation once they attain the enlightenment. And so the yoga tradition seems to have that kind of ideal as well. Now, so it's through pratiprasava that you can completely eliminate even the burnt seeds of the kleshas. And so then they're finally totally eliminated. Okay. Then, next paragraph of the same commentary is helpful in just getting a handle on these three stages. The commentators understand the process of eradicating the kleshas as a threefold sequence. First, the cloth is cleaned. The example is doing your laundry. Okay. First, the cloth is cleaned by shaking it in the air or washing it in water, and this removes the larger chunks of dirt. That's Kriya Yoga. Okay. You get out the gross stains. I don't mean gross as, ew, gross. I mean like the biggest or most, the least subtle. Okay. They could also be gross in the other sense. Okay. It is then washed more carefully by adding a cleaning agent or beating it against a stone. That might sound funny, but it's still done in India. In training center, everybody's beating their clothes. Clothes abuse. As is still the custom in India, and this removes the finer, more ingrained dirt, okay? That corresponds to dhyana, beating the clothes. And then the third one, but to completely and absolutely remove all subtle impressions of the soiled spots, says Ramananda Saraswati, you ultimately have to destroy the cloth itself. This is kind of intense. This is literally throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Or the other example is if you have a fly sitting on your head and your friend's like, oh, I'll take care of that. I'll get rid of that fly. And you take a sledgehammer and you whop your friend over the head and you kill him you get rid of the fly, but you also kill your friend in the process. So it is a little funny. But I think this is true to the yoga tradition, is that to really get rid of those hard to get, those really tough to remove stains, you've got to just destroy the cloth itself, which means death. Okay, but death, not just, see, the thing is, there's death and there's death. What do I mean by that? I can kill myself right now. I'm not going to get pratiprasava. Why? Because I haven't attained enlightenment. I haven't realized my true nature as Purusha. Right? And so what will happen to me if I kill myself? Or if somebody else kills me, more likely? What's going to happen to me? I have to come back. Rebirth. We're going to get to that in a second. I'm not out of the woods because I have to come back. Exactly. As many times as it takes for me to eventually go through the proper yogic processes, ultimately attain asampragata samadhi. And then finally, after that samadhi state, if I can die, then I can die. For good, once and for all. Good riddance. Okay. So that's the yogic idea here. You have to destroy the cloth. That's pratiprasava. Again, clearly Bryant is favoring an ontological interpretation of pratiprasava. Okay. Then he says, likewise, the grosser aspects of the kleshas are eliminated by Kriya Yoga, the more subtle aspects by meditation, but as indicated by the last sutra on pratiprasava, the actual burnt seeds or residual impressions of the now impotent samskaras are not completely dissolved until the mind, along with all its latent samskaras, merges back into its matrix at the death of the yogi who has attained the highest state of samadhi. Okay? So, keep this in mind as we move forward. And for the rest of the class, we're going to be discussing Sutras 12, 13, and 14. Very important sutras that explain the yogic doctrines of karma and rebirth. I just finished writing a book called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, and I talk about some of these issues in the book in much more detail. For instance, some of the questions that are raised in these sutras, these next sutras we're about to read. What exactly is the law of karma according to yoga philosophy? And there are two terms that I'll explain in a bit. Is it a retributive law of karma or is it an evolutionary doctrine of karma? Another big question. What exactly, who or what is it that reincarnates? You might think that's obvious, but it's not obvious. And in fact, different traditions within Hinduism have different answers to that question. We'll see what answer yoga gives. Actually, it's not that clear what answer yoga gives, unfortunately. And then another question, there are others, but these are just some of the ones I thought of, and I ran out of time, actually. But is regression to a non-human birth possible in your next life? This is a very common question I'm asked. When I was writing my book, one or two people asked me, so can we really become like like an amoeba or a plant? And again, different Hindus will give you different answers. Different traditions have different answers. And we'll talk about that too. So we'll get to all these. If hopefully, remind me if I forget to address one or more of these questions. Okay, so let's look at 2.12. Please repeat after me. This is page 195 of Bryant. Klesha mulaha karma shayaha drishta adrishta janma vedaniyaha. Good. Okay, the karmasaya, I'm just going to use the term karmasaya because it's more expressive. Okay, so he says the stock of karma, that's fine, in the form of samskaras. Okay, samskaras are what? Latent mental impressions, exactly, yes. Good. Okay, so this karmashaya, the stock of karma in the form of samskaras, has the kleshas as its root, klesha mulaha. Its mula, its root, are the kleshas, these 5 kleshas. Then, drishta, this life. Because it literally means seen, so the present life, the one that we see now and experience. And adrishta, future lives, lifetimes, future births. Adrishta. Drishta, adrishta, janma, birth, so life or birth. Vedaniyaha, to be experienced. So that karmashaya, in the form of samskaras, or karma, good and bad karma both, will be experienced, and it has as its root the 5 kleshas, and the fruits of that karma definitely will be experienced either in this life, drishta janma, or in a future life, adrishta janma. That's what this sutra is saying. So we get built into this one sutra, very packed, both the doctrine of karma and the doctrine of rebirth. And you can see how they go hand in hand, right? Karma entails rebirth, okay? Now, let's look at the commentary. I'm skipping the first paragraph. So bottom of page 195. He talks about Vyasa's commentary. Vyasa then discusses varieties of karma, good and bad, and its fructification. Now look, here's the thing to begin with. Just any naive reader of this text, any kind of reader actually, I think they'll face a question here. They're like, well, all karma has kleshas at its root. What about good actions? What about Kriya Yoga, the very practices that it's recommending? Tapa, Svadhyaya, these are good things, spiritual practices. What about Ashtanga Yoga? These are good actions. Are kleshas at the root of all those actions? And if so, how the heck do we get out of this cycle of rebirth and attain liberation? It gets a little bit weird. And the thing is, this is my own opinion, and you guys can form your own judgment after you read the commentary carefully. I feel like Bryant doesn't directly answer this question. He doesn't give a very clear answer to the question. And so I've tried to clarify at least my understanding of how the heck we can get out of this cycle of karma and rebirth. He hints at it, and he mentions some traditional commentators which talk about it, but I don't think it's that a very clear picture emerges from his commentary. So we'll read the commentary, and then I'm going to explain my understanding of these sutras. Okay. So Vyasa discusses varieties of karma, good and bad. So note, it includes both good and bad karma, and its fructification. The examples Vyasa gives of good karma include performing austerities, chanting mantras, those fall under Kriya Yoga, remember? Cultivating samadhi, and worshipping Ishvara or the great sages with enthusiasm and determination. All the spiritual practices recommended by the Yoga Sutras itself. right? Such activities bear fruit in this lifetime. He illustrates bad karma as harmful activities directed toward certain kinds of people. We can skip a lot of this. One of the points that Vyasa makes is that if you do something extraordinarily good, then the results, the karmic results, you'll get pretty quickly after your good action. And if you do something extraordinarily horrendous, morally reprehensible, you'll experience the fruits of those morally reprehensible actions also quite quickly, or you can experience them quite quickly. You don't have to necessarily wait for the next life. But then there's the opposite question, which is like, wait a minute, what about the Hitlers of the world who they didn't seem to be punished all that badly in this life, as far as we can tell. And then the karma doctor says, don't worry, he will be in the future life, right? So they're not off the hook. Okay, now, page 196. Middle of the page, Bryant says, whether good or bad, all karma is stored or imprinted as samskara, latent mental impression, in the chitta, the mind, and in general may manifest its fruits in either this life or the next. Activities are virtuous or non-virtuous and produce corresponding fruits. In the next sutra, Patanjali states that the particulars of one's life, and we'll get to that in the next sutra, 2.13. The type of birth, quality of life. So type of birth is jati. Quality of life experience, bhoga it's called, and lifespan, ayu, are all the fruits or results of one's karma. But the fruits of karma ultimately have the klesas as the root, mula. It is these klesas that influence one to act in good or bad ways. Kleshas are equally responsible for making us act in both good and bad ways. The way he's putting it, I think, is a little confusing. Because then where does it leave spiritual aspirants, and the whole thing seems quite hopeless. Or do you have an answer to that that's obvious that I'm missing before I go into my own take and my critique of Bryant? No? Okay. I think it's really, actually in Hinduism in general, you read a lot of these texts. It's not just Yoga Sutra, but other texts in like other Hindu scriptures. You'll find all sorts of elaborate descriptions of you do something good, it'll generate good karma, and then good things will happen to you. You do something bad, you'll generate bad karma, bad things will happen to you. And they rarely talk about spiritual practice as in that same context. So it can be kind of discouraging unless you read between the lines and you figure it out for yourself. And so I'm going to share with you what I've understood. Okay. Then he says, in the next sutra, oh yeah, I already read that. But the fruits of karma ultimately have the kleshas as the root, mula. Oh, I already read that. Okay, sorry. Oh, okay, the last sentence. Therefore, there is a vicious cycle. Kleshas provoke karma, and karma fuels the kleshas. Okay, so how do you get out of it? Here's the trick. Here's how I see it. So let me first explain what's been explained so far. The kleshas, those 5 kleshas, lead to the performance of any kind of morally bad action. What's the result? It generates what's called papa, demerit. This is not some metaphysical entity. It's a samskara. In other Hindu traditions, it's a metaphysical thing, but not in this tradition, as far as I can tell. So it's literally just it's a latent mental impression stored in the subtly physical mind. Okay. It's a subtly physical entity, demerit. That demerit produces bad karmic consequences, either later in this life or in a subsequent life. Okay? Now, what's the opposite scenario? The kleshas lead us to perform a good action, but this good action can be performed with 2 different attitudes. This is what's crucial. And this is what he hints at but isn't very clear about as far as I can tell. One is, let's say, what's a good action? Let's say Kriya Yoga. I engage in Kriya Yoga. That's definitely a good action, according to Patanjali. Okay, I perform Kriya Yoga, but my intention is, if I perform Kriya Yoga well, I'm going to get a great next birth. And I'll be born in a wealthy family, and I'll be having lots of milkshakes, and blah, blah, blah. What happens then? I do generate punya because it's a good action. But because that action was, my performance of the Kriya Yoga was sakama. Sakama. Kama means with selfish desires. Sa means with. What ends up happening? I enjoy good karmic consequences. I get those milkshakes. I get the wealthy family and all that. But that Kriya Yoga doesn't help me much in making spiritual progress. Now, imagine a third scenario. This third scenario is, I kind of wish that Bryant had more clearly articulated this scenario, because this is what's relevant for spiritual aspirants. This is what we need to know. If we perform the same good action, let's say Kriya Yoga, but with a completely different attitude, a more spiritual attitude, without any selfish desires at all, without any selfish desire for the karmic results, then what happens? First of all, that's not produced by the klesas. So the klesas are not the things that are leading us to do the good action, or it need not be. It gets a little bit complicated. The reason why it gets complicated is, remember, the first of the 5 klesas is what? Ignorance of what? Of the true self, exactly, yeah, right. So that means, so long as we have not realized our true nature as Purusha, we are ignorant and we suffer from at least that klesha, right? Now, arguably, all actions of any unenlightened person presupposes a sense of doership. I am the doer, karta bhava. That's actually, strictly speaking, false from the standpoint of yoga philosophy, because we're not the doer. That's our fundamental misunderstanding of our own identity, right? And so one way of thinking about it is, all good actions are also produced by kleshas, because even good actions presuppose, when I engage in a good action, I think I'm doing the good action. I'm the doer. I'm the karta, right? And insofar as we have that sense of doership, we're still in danger of getting trapped in that cycle. We have to ultimately transcend this sense of doership, right? But we do that. It's kind of like, you try to get to a roof by use a ladder. You climb up the ladder rung by rung, get up to the roof, and then what? You can kick the ladder away after that. So kind of like that. I think we begin engaging in good actions with the sense of doership. But as we purify our minds, slowly our sense of doership gets attenuated. And to that extent, the kleshas also get attenuated. And ultimately, we will perform good actions without any desire for karmic results, which are not produced by kleshas, or minimally produced by the kleshas. And then what happens? Now here again, there's some complexity. I think 2 things happen. These are all this is all kind of reconstruction, because these sutras are so compressed and laconic. And so the commentators have to do a lot of extra work and extrapolation. So this is just my suggestion based on my understanding of the text and the commentaries, that if you engage in good actions in a nishkama way, which means without any selfish desires, what happens? 2 things. First, purification of mind. Purification of, I wrote mental, that's not. Purification of mind through the destruction of kleshas. So now this is very important, the fact that the kleshas occur here, whereas in these, kleshas only are at the beginning. You see, here what's happening is, through this nishkama good action, we purify our minds by actually reducing and ultimately eliminating the kleshas, and ultimately that leads to our liberation. Okay? And so the key here is, even when you're engaging in spiritual practices, this is what's really important for spiritual aspirants. Just engaging in spiritual practices is not enough. You have to inspect your attitude. You have to be mindful of the attitude with which you're engaging in your spiritual practices. And you have to be very careful here, because if your attitude is still something if your desire is still something selfish, then you may end up getting trapped in this cycle of rebirth. So it's very important the only desire that you should have is enlightenment, realization, or purification of mind. And then the second result, so this is how, it's confusing, but I put the 2 arrows like this. So this would be like first result, and then second result. The second result would be that this nishkama good action generates punya, just like the good action which is sakama, with selfish desires. So you still get that merit, and then that leads to good karmic consequences as well. And so it's kind of 2 for 1. You get the good karmic consequences and you get mental purification. If you don't desire the good karmic results, that's the trick. And if you do desire the karmic results, you fall into this number 2 category, and then you don't get the purification of mind. And of course, it's not an all or nothing thing. You can be like 50% selfish, and then the results are mixed. Yeah, Leela.
Where does prarabdha and panita karma come into play?
Prarabdha karma, and then what's the other?
Prarabdha and panita karma. Panita is really,
Sanchita, I think you meant. Sanchita karma?
yeah, but if you do in a third way, then does it certainly could get rid of that prarabdha, which is this life.
Yeah, so we're going to get to that later in the commentary, hopefully, if we have time. But the idea is that through this third paradigm, you eliminate, and if you attain liberation, you eliminate all the sanchita karma, which means all the stored up karma that would have fructified in a subsequent life, but because this is your last life, all that gets eliminated. But it doesn't eliminate prarabdha karma. Prarabdha karma is the remaining karma you have that you have to live out in this life. Okay, and Sankhya texts will use the metaphor of a potter's wheel. It spins like this, but even after the potter lets go, it doesn't just stop immediately. It'll just keep going for a little bit, not always. But so that continued momentum of the potter's wheel is likened to the prarabdha karma. The Jivan Mukta at that point is just waiting out his time until he can attain that ontological pratiprasava and leave the physical body. That's the idea. Okay. Now, I think he muddies the waters here, Bryant, by bringing in a lot of interesting ideas, but which I found it kind of confusing, to be honest. Really interesting in their own right, but just not exactly all that helpful in clarifying these 3 different kind of paradigms. He talks about different ways that klesas, which seem to be inherently bad things, right? There's 5 things: ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, clinging to life. These are all the things that are responsible for all of our suffering, right? In what sense can klesas lead to good things happening? This is the question he asks. How can we start with something that seems inherently bad, a klesha, like lust or anger, attachment, and result in something great like God realization? And he gives these examples from the scriptures. I think he's like dancing around the idea of this third kind of framework for spiritual practice and spiritual aspirants, because we have kleshas. All of us have kleshas. That's why we're sitting here. That's why we're trying to make spiritual progress here. We have kleshas. Now what do we do with them, right? So I wanted to mention, because I do think it's just interesting in its own right, but I think that the clearer way to think about it is along these lines, this third paradigm. So this is page 197. Let me read it to you, because I'm excited, because as a Ramakrishna monk and devotee, this quote is like a money quote. Okay, middle of 197. A verse in the Bhagavata Purana states that, quote, those who always dedicate their desire, anger, fear, affection, sense of identity, and friendship to Hari, Krishna, enter for certain into a state of being. Kamam krodam, bhayam sneham, aikyam sauhridam evacha, nityam haro vidadato, yanti tanmayatam hite. The verse says, all these bad things, like all the kleshas themselves, desire, anger, you can turn them to God. And if you turn them to God, you ultimately realize God. It's a very interesting verse. And then he says, according to the Bhagavata, the highest meditation and goal of life is total absorption in God, even if this is generated out of animosity, as was the case with Kamsa, who along with other demoniac adversaries of Krishna attained liberation simply by virtue of their minds being fixed undeviatingly on God, albeit in animosity. So if you have like an arch nemesis who's always thinking about you, ultimately you can, there could be a good, if it's God, if it's the enemy of God can realize God just through obsessively thinking about his enemy. It's an interesting thing. But now, coming back to this verse, see, in the gospel, on many occasions, Sri Ramakrishna says things like, when people come to him helplessly and say, like, what do we do? I have all this lust and anger. He goes, can you eliminate these things? It's not really possible and it's not realistic. More firiye dao, he would say in Bengali, which means give them a Godward turn. Turn those things like lust and anger and greed toward God. If you have to lust after God. If you have to feel anger, feel angry toward God for not revealing himself to you. If you have to be greedy for God, and that kind of a thing. So I was always thinking, and I had asked multiple people and nobody could give me a good answer, where in the scriptures do we find evidence for this kind of practice that Sri Ramakrishna is recommending? And I think this is the best scriptural reference I've found, the most direct support for it, from Bhagavata Purana 10.29.15. And I would suggest that there are two different ways of thinking about this. One is you have these unwholesome feelings, desires, right? And one approach is you go to God and unburden yourself to God. So Holy Mother recommended this as a prayer. She said, whatever you're thinking, whatever troubles you're facing, just unburden your heart to God. I think this verse will support that. It's partly because of the word vidatataha in Sanskrit, which can be interpreted in different ways. So one way is, whatever bad stuff you're experiencing, say, God, here I am, warts and all, now take care of it. That's one approach. The second one is more radical, and I think this is maybe more what Sri Ramakrishna had in mind. He did have in mind both, because Girish Ghosh, when he was struggling with alcoholism, what did he tell Girish? Next time you want to drink, offer it to Divine Mother first, and then you drink. So that's kind of like the first approach. The second approach is, the more radical one, as I said, is you actually turn your desire toward God, whatever the desire or the anger or the greed. In that process, what happens? Whatever that feeling was, it undergoes a transmutation. It becomes sublimated into something completely different, right? Lust is no longer lust when you're lusting after God. Greed is no longer greed when you're greedy for God. It undergoes a kind of alchemical transmutation. That's, I think, the secret of Sri Ramakrishna's, that teaching of his. You see what I mean? But you don't have to think about it. All you have to work on doing is, I feel lust right now, let me direct my lust toward God. And then God will take care of the rest, and the lust will get transformed, basically, into this intense aspiration for the divine. Okay. So now, where do I think Bryant hints at this third framework? It's on page 198, where he mentions Vijnana Bhikshu, one of the later commentators. He says, Vijnana Bhikshu notes that the laws of karma apply only when they are performed out of ego. You see? Ego, because there's selfishness in both cases, right? Which we recall Patanjali defines as confounding the true Purusha self with the mind and body. But if you perform the same action without ego, without selfish desires, you can actually attain liberation and eliminate the klesas. That's the idea. So any questions? Because that's important, but a little bit subtle. Before we move on. We're good. Okay, good. So now, here we go. We've got 2 more sutras to go. 2.13. Sati mule tadvipako jati ayuhu bhogaha. Okay. Sati mule, as long as the mula, the root, exists, the root in the form of the kleshas. This is going back to the previous sutra, because that karmasaya has kleshas at its root, right? Okay, sati mule, tadvipakaha. Its fructification, that karmasaya ultimately will fructify. As what? 3 things. Jati, the type of birth you get. Usually they have in mind what species. And so you can already get a sense of the answer to this question. Is regression to a non-human birth possible in yoga philosophy? The answer is a resounding yes. So be careful. Okay. And actually, let me mention now, because I'll probably forget later. Some people are not comfortable with this as an answer. And so they give other answers. Other Hindus, within the Hindu fold, there's a whole range of views. There's a spectrum of views on this issue. And on the other side of the spectrum, on this side of the spectrum, with Patanjali, guess who? Vivekananda. Because Swami Vivekananda was asked once, hey, is it really possible? It sounds funny to regress to a non-human birth. He says, yeah, if you engage in bestial activities, you will probably be reborn as a beast, as a non-human animal. He says it. That's the classical view. More or less all classical Hindu texts support that view. But some modern Hindu figures disagree, or at least largely disagree. And so at the other side of the spectrum, we have certain modern Hindu figures, and to make things more interesting, you know how I like sparking controversy. And so there's another direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, a brother monk of Swami Vivekananda, who holds the opposite view. Can you guess who? Let's see. This is a good quiz. Who's written books on, this is a hint, because how many of the direct disciples have written books on karma and rebirth? Come on, Suman? Who? Yeah, very good, exactly. Medhananda. Medhananda, in his books, he has multiple books on karma and rebirth. He says in one place, at least one place, he says, some people think that one can regress from a human birth to a non-human birth. False. It's not true. That never happens. He just denies it. And I give the references in my book, the Karma and Rebirth book, if you're interested. So it's quite interesting that within our tradition, there's actually disagreement about this issue. It's a hot issue in a certain way, and some people find it deeply unpleasant to think about. I find it quite logical and fine. You know, in a way, it's satisfying it gives you more motivation to do good things so that you can continue as a human being and something better maybe. But anyway, different people will feel, and then there are two other people I'll mention in terms of modern Hindu figures on the other side of the spectrum, along with Medhananda. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and Sri Aurobindo. But they don't take as extreme a stand as Medhananda just outright denies that we can regress from a human birth to a future non-human birth. Sri Aurobindo and Radhakrishnan say, look, it's theoretically possible to regress from a human birth to a non-human animal birth, or even to plants or something, but it's extremely unlikely, and in practice probably never happens, something along those lines. So it's like almost the Medhananda view, but not quite. And on the other side, you get classical Hindu texts and figures, and you get Swami Vivekananda, interestingly. And there's a whole range in between, and okay? So that's an interesting question. Now, okay. There are a few things here. Well, there's a lot to discuss. Actually, we probably have to continue this next week. But anyway, here's the thing. This sutra is telling us that this karmasaya, in the form of samskaras, good and bad samskaras, which are the result of good and bad actions, fructifies in the form of three things. Okay? Jati, what species are we born into? Human, non-human, whatever, plant, some other non-human animal, whatever. Span of life, ayu. How long do we live? Lifespan. Some people die at the age of 5, tragically. Other people live till they're 97. That's karmically determined. Third, life experience, bhoga. Bhoga has different meanings in different contexts. This means life experience. What does that mean? We're going to see very quickly in the next sutra that it means, basically, it boils down to pleasant and unpleasant experiences. And the ratio of pleasant and unpleasant experiences, each of us will have different ratios. Why? Our past karma. Now, this is interesting. It's interesting for a number of reasons, but one of them is everything is up for grabs and everything is open to different interpretations, but one interpretation of this sutra in the context of other sutras is that, look, the yogic doctrine of karma and rebirth does not preclude free will. It's not thoroughgoingly deterministic. It doesn't say that karma determines absolutely everything we do and think and say. It only determines three main things: what species we're born into, the overall balance of pleasure and pain in our life, and our lifespan. But there's so many things. Will I take another sip of this herbal tea? I just did, right? And was I free in doing that? Maybe according to yoga philosophy, I was. It wasn't necessarily karma. Now again, just to make things fun and interesting, let me give you an opposite view. And let me not say who it is until after I read it to you. We'll have a guess. Okay, somebody says the following: nobody has ever seen anything produced out of nothing. If anything arises in the mind, that also must have been produced from something. When we speak of free will, we mean the will is not caused by anything. But that cannot be true. The will is caused. And since it is caused, it cannot be free. It is bound by law. That I am willing to talk to you and you come to listen to me, that is law. Everything that I do or think or feel, every part of my conduct or behavior, my every movement, all is caused and therefore not free. This regulation of our life and mind, that is the law of karma. Who said it? Who? No, but close. Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda said it. I've got a whole essay on this. It'll be coming out if you're interested. It's a chapter of a Festschrift. Do you know what a Festschrift is? Does anyone know what a Festschrift is? That's a good nerdy academic word. Festschrift is a German word, but it's been imported in English by academics. If an academic has had an illustrious lifelong career as an academic and produced very groundbreaking work, their friends and colleagues and students may produce a Festschrift in honor of that great senior professor. And they'll write essays relating to his work. And ideally, it shouldn't just be like, you're the best, but it'll be like critical and thoughtful and constructive. So there's a Festschrift on Āraṇya Chakraborty. Have any of you heard of Āraṇya Chakraborty? He's a very prominent scholar of Indian philosophy and a friend of mine. And so I was asked to contribute a chapter on for this Festschrift. And he is one of the few scholars to have done academic work on Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's views on free will, interestingly. And so I engaged his work, critically engaged it. And the chapter is on Swami Vivekananda's views on free will. And it's called From Karmic Determinism to Divine Freedom. And I argue, and you can argue with me on this, but I argue that Swami Vivekananda defended a thoroughgoing karmic determinism. Karma literally determines everything. Everything we do, everything we think, every thought that arises in our mind, every feeling we experience, and so on. Okay, so the law of karma is completely deterministic and leaves no room for free will. The yoga philosophy view seems to be a bit different. I think one mainstream interpretation of the yoga approach to karma is that it determines these three main coordinates, jati, ayu, bhoga, but that's not exhaustive, and there's so many things that we can still engage in freely. Okay, so that's one question. Another one. Oh, we're going to get to, we'll try to get to both those. Okay, so now, let's see. Okay, let's talk about question 2. What is the reincarnating entity? Why is this a problem? Or is there an obvious answer? What do you think? What do you think Patanjali says here? Any guesses? The subtle body. That's a good guess. Huh? The subtle body. Here's the problem, okay? Sankhya texts, the Sankhya Karika, which is one of the main texts of Sankhya, gives a direct answer to the question, what is the reincarnating entity? And the answer is the subtle body. The term used in Sanskrit is linga sharira. Linga sharira or sukshma sharira. Okay? Subtle body, no problem, except there is a problem, even on the Sankhya side. What's the problem? We've kind of discussed it before. I'll mention it briefly again. Okay, what is the subtle body? Is it conscious or unconscious? Or non-conscious? Not conscious, because it falls on the side of Prakriti. It's a subtle form of matter. And insofar as a subtle form of matter, it falls on the side of Prakriti, jada, insentient. How can something insentient reincarnate? What does that even mean? Yeah. Can we get a mic? Because online people are not going to be able to hear. Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. So it's a nice point. That's why I want online people. Wait, hold on, Suman. Hold your horses. Okay, there we go.
It is by in itself a jada padartha,
Yeah,
but
right.
it is being animated by the being behind it. It's
Right.
just like when I'm going from here to New York, I'm not going to take all my clothes. I want to take only my body, physical body is going to go. Right now I'm
what's the
wearing-
New York example again?
Like right now when I'm wearing this shirt, the shirt is animated because of my body, right?
Okay.
But when I go to, let's say, another place, New York, I'm not going to take this shirt. And I'm going to go alone, even though the shirt itself is a jada padartha.
Right, like so it's no longer animated if you...
Yeah, it's no
leave it
longer
behind.
once you take it out.
Yeah, okay, right. So that is one of the standard answers, which is, and it's actually mentioned in one of the karikas in the Sankhya Karika, which is that that which is inherently insentient seems to be sentient because it's activated by, in some sense, activated by Purusha, okay? But there's problems with that too, or at least arguably there's a problem with that too. What's the problem? Well, according to Sankhya metaphysics, there should be a radical dualism between Purusha and Prakriti. And actually the two shouldn't interact in any way. In reality, they're completely separate and they have nothing to do with each other. And so how do you explain concepts like activation, animation, right? That's the term you used. When Purusha and Prakriti have literally, at a metaphysical level, nothing to do with each other. And so there's still complexities there. Okay, that's on the Sankhya side. Now, Patanjali's yoga philosophy is supposed to be based on Sankhya in large part, right? And so you might think, yeah, so it inherits the Sankhya answer. And so Patanjali will say that the reincarnating entity is also the subtle body, even if it may have some philosophical problems or difficulties. Fine. But another problem, interestingly and strangely, in the entire text of the Yoga Sutras, there is not a single mention of a subtle body anywhere. Not one mention of the subtle body. And that's surprising. For a text as comprehensive and as technically precise as this one, for Patanjali to just leave out the concept of the subtle body seems almost unthinkable. But still, it's just the case. We don't have, the subtle body is not introduced anywhere in any of these sutras, okay? So now, as a result, what happens is traditional commentators and scholars have had to kind of speculate beyond the text in a way. And some have read a subtle body into the scripture, even though it's not explicitly stated. And some of the traditional commentators do that, like Vijnana Bhikshu. He mentions Vijnana Bhikshu on page 199 as endorsing an idea of a subtle body, but it's not actually explicitly mentioned. And there is a competing view, there's a competing interpretation which says there is no subtle body that reincarnates. And it gets very complicated in the details, but the basic idea is that there's only one chitta, mind, and it's all pervasive, sarva vyapi, which means there aren't distinct, you don't have a distinct subtle body from you, and I don't have a distinct subtle body from you. If we had distinct subtle bodies, then we would have, you know how, I'm sure you guys have heard some reports of near-death experiences when what happens? They talk later about how if they're in a hospital room or something, it's as if they're at the top corner of their room looking down at the body, right? So Vedanta and then other Indian views which believe in a subtle body, they can easily explain that as it's the soul in association with the subtle body. But that subtle body needs to be a kind of like a spatio-temporally delimited entity, right? It needs to be able to move from this physical body that's dying up to the top of this room, right? In yoga, it seems as if Vyasa, at least, who's the first commentator and the most important commentator on the Yoga Sutras, he seems to say that the chitta is all-pervasive and that it's not individualized in that way, which makes it more difficult to understand how the subtle body can even be a concept, first of all, and how that can reincarnate in any way. These things get very complicated, and I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but I want to open the can of worms and then let the worms float about and enjoy the worms and read my book. That's the end of it's the bottom line. Okay. Now, I want to address this third question, and in order to do that, I know it's 8:29, but just give me 5 more minutes. Well, let's make a start on 2.14. Here we go. 2.14. Te hlada, HL, hlada. It's very Mexican, right? Or Spanish, yeah. Hlada, paritapa, palaha, punya, apunya, hetutvat. Yes, okay. These What these three things mentioned in the previous sutra. Jati, ayu, bhoga, type of birth, so what species you're born into, span of life, lifespan, life experience, balance of pleasure and pain. These three things bear the fruits of pleasure and pain. Klada is the pleasure. Yeah, amazing, you're happy, you're thrilled, awesome. And then paritapa, oh, that sucks. Depression, sadness, dejection. As a result of what? Virtue and vice. Punya, virtue, or I think merit and demerit are better terms. Virtue and vice are so loaded with the kind of Christian theological original sin ideas. And so anyway, merit and demerit. So punya, merit, apunya, demerit. Okay. So now, good action leads to punya, merit, which leads to determining our jati, ayu, bhoga. And under bhoga especially, our life experience is how much pleasure we have in our life, how much pain we have in our life. And that's the hlada paritapa. So I see it as kind of elaborating especially that bhoga part of the three karmic results of our good and bad actions. Okay? So now, let's read it, and then we'll talk about the answer to this question. Is karma retributive or evolutionary? And then we'll call it a day. Okay. He says, this is bottom of page 202. This sutra states that vice, apunya, or as I say, demerit, apunya, bad karma, produces a short lifespan and distressful, paritapa, type of birth and life experience. Virtue, punya, this is merit, good karma, produces pleasurable hlada experiences. So the klesas provoke karma, and karma, depending on its nature, produces different qualities of births, lifespans, and life experiences, and these in turn produce corresponding pleasure and pain. Okay, actually that's enough. Now, let me explain this. There are two basic ways of understanding this law of karma, the doctrine of karma. I call them retributive, the retributive doctrine of karma and the evolutionary doctrine of karma. The retributive doctrine of karma is a reward and punishment model of karma. I do something good, God rewards me with. God rewards me, well, that's tricky in yoga philosophy because God is not the karma phaladatta. That's the case in Vedanta, but not in yoga philosophy. So let's not bring God into this. But I do something good and I am rewarded with what? Punya, good samskaras, merit, which then leads to good karmic consequences. Yay, nice things happen to me. I'm given a lollipop, a karmic lollipop. And then I do something bad. What happens? It generates demerit in the form of bad samskaras, which then produce unpleasant experiences for me. Boo, and I get slap on the wrist or something much worse. Boom, Mike Tyson punches me, KO. Okay, and so these are the two ways of thinking about it. This is retributive because it's the law of karma is a kind of doctrine of retribution. We get what we reap what we sow. That's the basic idea, right? Now, there's a different way of thinking about, well, first of all, so far, the Yoga Sutra seems to be suggesting, especially this sutra, hlada paritapa. The result of punya and apunya is hlada and paritapa. Good karma results in yay, happiness. Bad karma, boo, unhappiness. Sounds very retributive, right? Now, but there's a complexity because there's a second understanding of karma, which I like a lot better. I think it's more in line with our tradition. And it's not mutually exclusive with the retributive exactly. So let me explain. The evolutionary doctrine of karma is one that says, look, the overarching or the primary purpose of karma is not to reward or punish us, but to foster our moral and spiritual evolution, our moral and spiritual growth. Okay? Now, along the way to making spiritual progress, it's important that we reap what we sow. As Sri Ramakrishna would say, if you eat a chili, won't your tongue burn? That's the example he gives, right? Which means you do something bad, you will have to reap what you sow. You're going to pay for it. But that's not an end in itself. The punishment is not the end in itself, the karmic punishment. The point is, when I do something bad and then I reap the bad consequences, I then learn from my mistake, ideally. I say, whoa, I better not do that again. And then what happens? I avoid it in the future. And then what happens? Wow, I'm growing spiritually and morally. So there's a way of, so the retributive model of karma is like the overarching or the ultimate aim of karma is to reward or punish us. The evolutionary doctrine of karma says there's a truth to that idea. You reap what you sow, but that's not the ultimate purpose of karma. The ultimate purpose is our moral and spiritual growth and evolution. And in order to grow spiritually and morally, we have to suffer the consequences of our actions. Right? Experience the consequences of our actions. And so I think it's possible to interpret the Yoga Sutras along the lines of either way, the retributive doctrine of karma or the evolutionary one. I don't see, I don't want to say that. It would be an interesting research project to see like what evidence in the sutras can you find to support one or the other model of karma. This is strong evidence for the retributive doctrine of karma, but as I said, you can accept this, and I think Sri Ramakrishna would accept this, Vivekananda would accept it, even Sri Aurobindo, but all of them also believed in an evolutionary doctrine of karma. And so it's possible to fold a retributive dimension into a broader evolutionary approach to karma. Okay? Yes, Natalie. Can you give the mic to Natalie? That's easier. You don't have to run across the room. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. Do you know if Bryant sides on the side of retributive or evolutionary?
That's a good question. I don't see him necessarily addressing the issue.
Maybe he dances around it.
Yeah, he's good at dancing. And he's a good dancer. What I would say is one can reconstruct from different things he says throughout the book more of an evolutionary doctrine of karma that has elements of retribution built into it. Because there are certain sutras we're going to get to eventually which say basically like prakriti, nature, is for the purpose, for the sake of purusha, purushartha. It's for purusha. And in that case, it's almost like this entire world, this entire life is conspiring to help us to be liberated, to get enlightenment in a certain sense. And yes, is there retribution? Yes. But the overarching purpose of the law of karma is for us ultimately to realize our true nature as Purusha. So I think one can make the case, but it requires a lot of work.
Are there traditions that are strictly retributive?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The question is for online people, are there any Hindu traditions that are strictly retributive? And there are. And in fact, the classical Hindu texts and figures tend to be purely retributive, at least as far as I can tell. And there are texts like Manusmriti, which can be pretty scary. Like it says things like, it'll scare you into being a vegetarian. It'll say things like, if you eat meat, you're going to be like a pig who's going to be eaten by other people in your next life, and like stuff like that. It gets pretty horrifying. And a lot of other things. So kind of like almost like a quid pro quo, like you do this bad thing, that very bad thing will happen to you in a subsequent birth, but in like a really gruesome way, in a kind of almost point-to-point way. So yeah, but that's one example. Yeah, thank you. Okay, yes, Anna has a question.
So Ma Devi would say, Ma Sharda Devi would say that when you call on the name of God, that you can. She said that life is full of suffering, and that by calling on the name of God, you can change your destined karmas.
Very
if you
good.
have to have an injury that's like the size of a plowshare, it can just come down to a finger.
A pinprick.
Or a pinprick. Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
exactly, absolutely.
But what is this? How do you square that with this understanding of karma? Because to me, that seems like she's saying, yes, we do have some set.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain how these square together?
Yeah. Oh, well, there are a couple things though. So, see, she believes in God, so she's speaking from a Vedantic standpoint, and she's by God's grace, our karma can be attenuated, if not eliminated, right? And so she says it can't be completely eliminated, but whatever bad things you did, which would have resulted in some really terrible bad stuff happening in the future, that's the plowshare, the wound of the size of a plowshare, can by God's grace be reduced to a bare minimum. Like, it's something bad, but it goes away pretty quickly. But then God's grace is operative there. Now again, this question comes in that Bryant raises again and again, which is to what extent does the Yoga Sutras admit theistic or something approaching a theistic God and the possibility of divine grace. And he believes that it does. And so if you believe that, then you can accept the kind of view that Holy Mother is endorsing. But there are other interpreters of the Yoga Sutras who push in the opposite direction and say that this is all bogus stuff, this theism and grace and all that. None of that has any place in yoga philosophy. But if you believe in God and you believe in divine grace, then that's a very powerful way of mitigating our good and bad karma, our karmic consequences, and making spiritual progress. And even if you don't believe in God and God's grace, remember, Kriya Yoga, in 2.2 we're told, Kriya Yoga leads to tanukarana, the attenuation of our klesas, which are at the root of all our karma. And so that amounts to the same thing. It's just more laborious. God is like, if you bring God in, it just makes things easier. Without God, it's like I think one of the great Sringeri Jagadgurus once said, he says, like, look, there are two ways of getting from place A to place B when you're taking a train. And let's say you got two heavy suitcases. One way is you get on the train and you put the suitcases on the luggage rack, and then you sit in peace and you chill and you listen to music or you do whatever you want, chat with your friends, your family. The other is, for the whole duration of the train ride, to be lugging those heavy suitcases on your shoulders. And there might be people, if you're doing that, and you're like, the whole time with 5 hours, you're like holding, other people on the other patch will be like, what the heck is this person doing? Like, doesn't he realize he could just put the suitcases down? But bhaktas feel that way about people who don't believe in God. It's like, goodness gracious, you just make things so much harder for yourself. Anyway, okay, so any other questions or comments?
I'm a little confused because Kriya Yoga is the path of action, consists of self-discipline, study, and dedication to the Lord. Aren't we talking about God there? Like,
yeah, I know, but remember, this is Bryant's commentary.
Okay.
And he's pushing a strongly devotional and theistic interpretation of the Yoga Sutras.
Oh.
And so for him, this Ishvara Pranidhana is Ishvara in a full-blown, full-blooded theistic God sense, and Pranidhana as surrender, devotional surrender. And I like that interpretation just as a spiritual aspirant. Now, as a scholar, I'm more doubtful about it. And I wear both caps, and they don't always fit well at the same time. Yeah. Okay, any last comments or questions before we wrap it up? And remember, heads up again, next two classes, July 10th and July 24th. So for our next class on July 10th, Thursday, please read Yoga Sutras 2.15 to 17. And that's pages 202 to 216 of Bryant's textbook. Thank you very much. I forgot to, and I didn't have time also, but to read some of Swamiji's commentary. So maybe I'll try to do some of that next time. Remind me if I forget. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.